All right, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Kansas Open Meetings Act, or KORA. We're going to go through a lot of different things about the Kansas Open Meetings Act, and hopefully you'll learn a little bit as we go through over the next hour a lot of these different things with KORA. As Kim said, I am going to be taking questions throughout, so if you do have a question, please type that into the chat. I'll be monitoring that as I go through the slides and would be happy to answer your questions as we go through. With that being said, let's go ahead and get started. All right, the Kansas Open Meetings Act, or KOMA, is about transparency. And it says that right in the statute that establishes the Kansas Open Meetings Act and all of the statutes that follow it. It says meetings shall be open to the public because a representative government is dependent upon an informed electorate. So we want to make sure that people have the information that they need in order to participate in government so that they know what's going on. Today, we're going to talk about several things with the Kansas Open Meetings Act. First, we'll talk about what it is. We'll talk about what it requires. We will address some of the areas where problems pop up, and this is going to be where we spend some time today, just talking about where problems do come up, because we know there are some areas where we need to be aware of problems. And then if you've ever been to any of my presentations, you know I always like to leave you with some best practices, things you can implement if you aren't already doing them, so that you can hopefully avoid some of the problems that we're going to talk about today. All right, so KOMA, or the Kansas Open Meetings Act, is the sunshine law for Kansas. It ensures that public business is being done in the light. And that simply means that we want to make sure that we're being transparent, that we make sure that any sort of public business is being taken care of in the light so that people can see what's going on and can participate. The requirement of the Kansas Open Meetings Act is that all meetings for the conduct of the affairs of and the transaction of business by agencies of the state, so any state agency, and the political and taxing subdivisions thereof shall be open to the public. Now, when it says political and taxing subdivisions thereof, obviously we are talking about cities and counties, but we're also talking about other taxing jurisdictions like water districts and watershed districts, townships, all of those types of things. They're all subject to the Kansas Open Meetings Act, and we want to make sure that those meetings, therefore, are open to the public. So how do we know if KOMA applies? How do we know whether or not we should be applying the rules that are stated in the Kansas Open Meetings Act? Well, we need to follow the money, because remember, it said taxing subdivisions. So when we talk about KOMA, we need to think about, does this entity receive tax dollars? Because if an entity receives tax dollars, it is likely subject to the Kansas Open Meetings Act. So what does that mean? Well, we need to talk about and think about, what is a meeting? A meeting can be in person or through technology if it involves the following things. It involves a majority of the body. That majority has to be communicating, and that communication has to be about business that could come before the body. And we always have to remember, when we talk about a meeting does not have to happen in the same physical place at the same physical time. So we need to keep in mind it involves a majority of the body. That majority has to communicate. The communication has to be about business that could come before the body, and it doesn't have to happen at the same time and all in the same place. Let's break that down. What is a meeting? It has to be a majority of the body, and a majority of the body is half plus one. So if we are thinking about majorities, we have to think half plus one. That means that a governing body with three, that means if there are two members of the body there, that is half plus one. Five means three, seven, a majority would be four, and for 10, the majority would be six. So we have to remember it's half plus one, so we have to have at least four if it's a body of seven, five members means that we need a majority of at least three. And obviously, when we have our three commission members, that means a majority would be two. Now, remember that we also have to count not just the total number of seats. We have to count the total number of seats, not just the filled seats. So that means, for instance, if you have a zoning board that has seven seats on your zoning board, but right now you have a couple of vacancies on that zoning board, a majority of that body would still be four because there are seven total seats, even though right now there are only five total members on that particular zoning board. So the number required for a majority does not change, even if all of the seats are not filled. That's important to remember. The majority does not change, even if all of the seats are not filled, because we have to count the total number of seats, not just the filled seats on the body. All right, so we've talked about what a majority is. That majority, again, remember, in order for it to be a meeting, that majority has to be communicating. And when we talk about communication, that can be through any medium. So it can be in person, it can be through email, it can be on the phone, it can be via text message. We can do it on a video conference like Zoom. Other technologies that may or may not exist right now could be used to communicate, and it can happen in separate phases. So it doesn't all have to happen in the same email. It can happen through a chain of emails or a chain of text messages or a series of phone calls or use of different technologies. It could be an email that is relayed via text. All of those things could be a medium through which you can have communication. And if you can communicate through that, you can have communication with a majority of the body. So we need to keep that in mind, that it doesn't matter what technological medium we use. It doesn't matter if we use different technical media in order to communicate. All that matters is that it has to be communication with a majority of the body. And of course, that communication has to be about business that may come before the body. And it's important to note here that we're talking about business that may come before the body. It's not business that is before the body. It's business that may come before the body. And what that means is that we have to think about current items that are under consideration. Obviously, that's business that's before the body right now. So that's pretty easy to think about. It's also pending agenda items. So maybe not things that are currently under consideration, but agenda items that may have been either laid on the table or agenda items that are coming up later on. We also have to think about future agenda items. So, for example, if you know that there is a topic that is coming up soon because the zoning commission your zoning board is meeting about that particular issue right now, and that's going to come before the county commission at some point, that's a potential future agenda item. And you have to be aware of that because that's business that could come before the body. And then, of course, there are matters that are under the jurisdiction of the body. So in other words, things that you're not currently dealing with, they're not on a current agenda, they're not on a future agenda, but they are matters that could come under the jurisdiction of the body. So for example, if there is discussion about the county buying property, and the county's not necessarily looking to buy any property right now, but they could buy property in the future. And if they do buy property, that would come under the jurisdiction of the county commission. So county commissioners, therefore, need to be in an open meeting to discuss potentially buying property, including the pros and cons of that sort of thing. They need to be in the context of an open meeting in order to have that conversation, because buying and selling property is under the jurisdiction of the county commission. And so they need to be in an open meeting to have that discussion. So that is all of those things: current items under consideration, pending agenda items, potential future agenda items, and matters that could fall under the jurisdiction of the body. All of those things constitute business that could come before the body. If all of those elements are present, then you have a meeting. So all three of those things have to be present. It has to be a majority of the body. They have to communicate, and that communication has to be about business that could come before the body. So if two members of a 5-member commission are talking, that is not a meeting because there are only 2 of them talking and 3 would be a majority. So if only 2 of them are talking, that is not a meeting regardless of what they are talking about. That is not a meeting at that point. However, if a third member of that same commission joins them and starts talking and starts engaging in that conversation, then we have to look at what are they talking about. Now, I often get this question of, well, what happens is it okay for all 3 commissioners to go to the same event or meeting? You all live in the same community, so of course it's okay for you to all go to the same event because there's nothing wrong with all 3 commissioners being at the same event or all 5 commissioners being at the same event. There may be some very important community events that you all do want to be at because you're members of that community. If that's the case, you may all be there, but you cannot communicate about business that could come before the body. So if you're all there, that's perfectly fine. You just can't communicate about business that can come before the body. Now, that doesn't mean that commissioners can never talk to each other outside of a commission meeting. You just can't talk about business that can come before the body. So if you're at the high school football game, you can talk to the other commissioners about things like the weather, how the game is going, whether or not you should have gone for it on 4th down, or whatever you want to talk about. You can have that conversation. You can talk about whether the coach is good or bad, or how the team looks this year, what the playoff chances look like. You can have that discussion. That is all perfectly fine. However, you cannot talk about things like how to maintain the county road that is outside of the high school, because that is business that could come before the body. So you can talk about the game all night long, and that's not a problem. But if you start talking about the road leading up to the school, or what you're going to do about snow removal or something like that, that's business that could come before the body, and those things need to be saved for an open meeting. All right, so if you have a meeting, what is required? Well, the primary requirement of the Kansas Open Meetings Act is notice. You have to publish notice in order for people to know what is going on as far as when a meeting will occur. That notice doesn't have to be formal. There's no special form that you have to put this notice on, but the notice does have to include 3 specific pieces of information. It has to include the date of the meeting. It has to include the time when the meeting will take place, and it has to include the location. Now, you remember that I said that a meeting can occur through any sort of media or technology. So if that is the case, the location of the meeting is the Zoom link, for example. Just as all of you clicked on the Zoom link to get into this particular meeting today to hear about the Open Meetings Act, if you're having a commission meeting and you want people to be able to participate via Zoom, or you're having a zoning meeting or something like that, the location is simply the Zoom link. If you're having a conference call and you want people to be able to participate via phone, then the call-in number is the location, just the same as the address and room number for a physical location would be. The same is true of a phone number if you're having a telephone conference, or a link if you're having a Zoom, a video conference. Those things are the location of the meeting. So it has to include the notice that you publish, has to include the date, the time, and the location. And this is logical because obviously you as a public person want to participate in a public meeting, you need to know when and where that meeting is going to occur so that you can participate. And of course, any requests for those notices, if a particular party makes a request that they be included on notices, that request is valid for the remainder of the fiscal year. So if somebody were to request that they be included on all future notices for your county commission, and they made that request today, they would get every notice from now until December 31st. However, on December 31st, that notice would expire and they would need to make a new notice to receive 2025 information. KOMA does not require, and this is important, KOMA does not require that there be a public comment period during an open meeting. You do not have to have public comment during an open meeting. Now, I say that, and I want to make sure that you understand that does not mean that you should not have public comment. It just means that public comment is not required in order to conform with the Kansas Open Meetings Act. Now, there are other specific times where other statutes may require that public comment is allowed at specific meetings. And if that is the case, you have to do that in order to comply with those statutes. But for the purposes of the Kansas Open Meetings Act, you do not have to allow for public comment at an open meeting. You also are not required to publish an agenda or publish meeting minutes under the Kansas Open Meetings Act. Again, some of those things may be required under other statutes in specific instances, but that does not mean that you have to do it in order to comply with the Kansas Open Meetings Act. And we're talking very specifically here about the Kansas Open Meetings Act. Now, I told you we're going to spend some time talking about where we run into problems. And one of the reasons that I like talking about where we run into problems is because in order for this particular session to be helpful to you, we have to talk not just about the definitions and the legalities of the Kansas Open Meetings Act, but we really have to start talking about where the problems are and what things we should avoid so that we don't run into those problems, so we don't get tripped up on those types of things. And so I want to spend a little bit of time here talking about where we run into problems and then spend some more time actually diving into some of those problems so that we know how to avoid those problems in the future. All right, so the big problem that we run into is governing body conversations outside of meetings that turn to business. So I gave you the example of being at the high school football game and you're talking about the game. Perfectly fine. There is no problem with that conversation. But then all of a sudden you remember, oh yeah, we do have that gravel road that runs out back behind the high school that some of the kids use to get back to the other side of the county. We need to talk about how we're going to maintain that road. Whoa, that's the problem. Because when you have that conversation turn from talking about the football game to, oh yeah, how are we going to maintain the road that runs out behind the high school? Now, all of a sudden, that conversation has turned from football game to business, and having that conversation turn to business is a problem because that turns that into a meeting that you did not provide notice for, which is a violation of the Kansas Open Meetings Act. So we need to be careful about that. And my caution to all elected officials, all members of boards, whether that be the zoning board or the health board or library board or whatever it might be, hospital boards, make sure that when you are talking to your other board members, you are not having conversations drift into business about business that could come before the body that you sit on. Make sure you're not having those kinds of conversations because that is where we get into the most trouble. So where are some other places where we run into problems? And I kind of highlight three different things here, and we'll talk about each of those. The first is serial meetings. The second is failing to publish those notices properly. And then executive sessions and specifically either having improper executive sessions or getting into the executive session improperly are the problems that we run into. I see we've got our first question though of the day. How do you have notice if you are sending an email to all board members for a vote on a topic? You should not be having votes on any topic via email. So if you're sending an email to the entire board, you can send an email to the board and say to the board, we are scheduling a meeting for such and such date, such and such time, because we need to vote on topic X. That is perfectly fine to send it to the board and let them know our next meeting is going to be on this date at this time so that we can schedule that meeting because we have to vote on this particular thing. Or if there's a situation where we need to have an emergency meeting, is everybody available to meet at 7? Those types of scheduling emails are fine. However, you cannot have a vote because you are taking up business outside of an open meeting. So when you are using email, you can communicate information to the board and say to the board, for instance, we need to have a meeting, or we are calling a meeting at such and such date on such and such time. However, that needs to be the extent of that communication is just to get the scheduling out there. You should not be having any substantive discussions about about the topics that you're going to actually take up at the meeting. The substantive discussions are for the meeting itself. You should only be doing scheduling via those emails and then having the substantive discussion at the actual meeting itself, rather than having those substantive discussions via email. So it's important that we always remember substantive discussions need to take place in the meeting. We can schedule and we can tell everybody, hey, we need to have a discussion about purchasing that property, or we need to have a discussion about signing that contract or approving that zoning or approving that special use permit. We're going to have that discussion on Tuesday at our next meeting or whatever it might be. But that should be the extent of the discussion in the email, is that we are going to schedule that discussion for a vote. All right, diving back in, again, we're going to talk about serial meetings, failure to properly publish notices, and then improper executive sessions as kind of the three problem areas that we run into. Obviously, there are other things that we run into that are problems, but we need to make sure that we are aware of these three problem areas because that's where big problems tend to crop up. And the first one is serial meetings. And just to define serial meetings so everybody knows what we're talking about, a serial meeting is when there is a series of interactive communications, which individually include fewer than a majority of the body, but the collective conversation ends up including a majority of the body. So it's like it's like the old game of telephone where one person goes and talks to one person, then they go talk to somebody else, and then they go talk to somebody else, and so on until you've included a majority of the body in that discussion. And those are the types of things that we want to make sure that we are avoiding. All right, so how do we avoid these types of serial meetings? And the first thing is getting back to the email issue. Do not reply all to emails, particularly for members of the governing body or for members of whatever governing board or whatever that may be. Do not reply all to emails. And the reason you don't want to reply all to emails is because if you do include some sort of substantive comment in an email, you don't want to reply to the entire body because then obviously you're including a majority of the body in that communication. So if you have if you get an email from the county clerk, including some scheduling, and you have a question about a particular item that is going to be on the agenda or something like that, don't reply all. Instead, send that back to just the county clerk or your county administrator. Don't reply all to that email, because if you reply all, then you can very easily get into communicating back and forth about the business that could come before the body. Secondly, do not tell commissioners what other commissioners have told you. And this is important, particularly for staff. We want to make sure that you are not unintentionally carrying messages back and forth between commissioners as kind of a go-between between those individuals. And then obviously discourage any unofficial communications by county staff. So you don't want to have something where the county clerk or somebody else on the staff or an administrative individual is talking to one commissioner or talking to one planning and zoning board member or somebody else on county staff, talks to one person and then goes and tells other members of the governing body what that person said and is taking messages back and forth between them. We want to discourage any sort of unofficial communications because, again, those are serial meetings. If you're having an individual go back and forth and gather information and pass that along through unofficial channels. We want to avoid that sort of thing, discourage any of that unofficial communication. And the best way to do that, again, is by remembering as county staff not to tell one commissioner, well, Commissioner so-and-so told me this, because again, now you are acting as the media through which those commissioners are now communicating outside of the open meeting. And we want to avoid that sort of behavior. All right, so next we have failing to properly publish notices. And this is kind of one of those technical issues that we get into where you may have all of the correct intent, you may have followed the proper processes for putting your notices together. You're just not getting them published in a timely fashion or published to the public. And so we want to make sure that we avoid those sorts of problems. And we want to make sure that we are getting the things done. And the best way to do that is to have a process. And my recommendation, and obviously this isn't required under KOMA, but my recommendation is whoever sets the meeting should also send out the notice. So in a lot of counties, that's the county clerk or somebody in the county administrator's office or the county manager's office. They will actually set the meeting. And if they set the meeting, they should also be responsible for sending out the notice. Because when you have that responsibility divided, there could be a miscommunication where the meeting gets set today and the person that actually sends out the notices might be out of the office today or may have had to leave early for a personal emergency or something like that. So we are better served to have whoever is setting the meeting also be responsible for sending out the notice. Special meetings should have a process for how that notice is made, whether that is after getting confirmation from the chair, you send out the notice then, or however you want to do that. But you should have a process in place for how those notices go out for special meetings, as well as how notices go out for your regular meetings. You should be able to send out your regular meeting notices on a schedule. If you know that you have a commission meeting every Monday at 10 o'clock, it should be very easy to send out notice of your commission meeting on Thursday at 3 o'clock because you know you have your regular commission meeting every Monday at 10 o'clock. And then obviously controversial topics should be noticed well in advance. You should be letting people know in advance if you know that there is a hot button issue that you're going to be taking up. You should be getting that notice out well in advance of actually taking up that topic because people are going to be watching to see when that controversial topic comes up. And if you notice it the day before or a couple of days before, people may feel like you are hiding information or trying to avoid letting them know when that's going to take place. On the other hand, if you put a notice out 3 or 4 weeks in advance to let people know that you're going to take up a controversial topic, that's not going to keep it from being controversial. That's not going to keep people from having strong feelings on one side or the other. What that will do, however, is it will keep people from thinking that you're trying to avoid that conversation or that you're trying to hide something from the public, because you put that notice out there well in advance so that everybody knew when that particular topic was coming up. We also need to make sure that our notices are being made public. And this is especially true now that we have a lot of different technology. We have websites and all of those kinds of things. And it could be something as simple as putting the notice on the website, but forgetting to make that particular post public. Those are the types of things where mistakes happen, and we need to make sure that those notices are being made public. Otherwise, that is a technical violation of the Open Meetings Act. And in order to do that, in order to make sure of that, we need to be consistent. But consistency requires that we be insistent about doing things the right way. So we have to insist that things be done correctly. And then we have to persist in doing them that way every single time. Because if we do not insist and persist, we will not have the good kind of consistency where we do things correctly every single time. So we need to be persistent and insistent about our process of how we go about making notices available and how we go about carrying out the requirements of the Open Meetings Act. That way, when we are persistent and insistent, we can be the good kind of consistent. All right, so let's talk about executive sessions, and more specifically, let's talk about improper executive sessions and where we run into problems. But first, we've got a question. It says our notices are done through our county website. Do we need to have citizens sign up each year? Right now, once on the list, they stay on the list. You can certainly allow people to remain on the list into perpetuity if you so choose. But under the Kansas Open Meetings Act, if you don't leave them on the list every year, then they fall off the list at the end of the fiscal year. So technically, if they stop receiving notices and they haven't requested to be put on the list again, that is not a violation of the Open Meetings Act on your part. Now, obviously, it's a service to the public and not something I would discourage you to do, to keep them on the list through into perpetuity, but you don't have to do it that way. If that's your process as a way of serving your county, though, that is certainly something that you can do. Another question, is public notification on web or social media page enough? Does it need to be both or more? You need to make sure that your notices are going out in a way that obviously is available to the public. Now, currently, state law requires that you have the notices be published in your official county newspaper, but obviously public notification on web and social media is also useful, because we all know that more people are looking at your county website and utilizing social media than are getting the official county newspaper looking for those notices. So it's definitely useful and something that I would encourage to make sure you're being transparent, but that's not required under the Open Meetings Act, but it is certainly helpful to get that information out there more consistently. There's a question, are there printouts available from today's session? Printouts of the slideshow that we were going through. You will get the slideshow after today's presentation. We will get that out there for you. It wasn't made available earlier, but we will make that available to all of you after the end of the session. And then we have a once a week paper. Is local radio news sufficient? Again, State law currently requires that official notices for counties have to be published in their county newspaper, in the official county newspaper. But you also need to make sure that you're getting that notice out there in other ways. And it is helpful to make sure that you're also doing that through other media, because again, we know that a lot of times people are not necessarily getting and following the local newspaper. And so using other media to make sure that your notices are getting out there to the public is always definitely helpful. Jumping back into the executive session discussion, let's first remember what an executive session is. An executive session is a closed portion of an otherwise open meeting. Oh, and looks like we have another question before I dive too deeply into executive session. What about a cancellation of a meeting? Obviously, if you have a meeting cancellation, those are going to come up much more closely to the meeting in all likelihood than just having a normal meeting. And so you want to get those out as quickly and as widely as possible so that, again, people don't think that the meeting was canceled because you're trying to hide something. And so if you have a cancellation of a meeting, putting it on your website, putting it out there in social media, putting it out there via radio or other things may be a more efficient way than just utilizing the official county newspaper, because that may get the information out there more widely. And again, this is about transparency. So getting the information out there more widely, although it's not required under the Open Meetings Act, is much more helpful because that gets the information to everyone a lot more quickly, because they're much more likely to see it on social media or hear it on TV or on the radio than they are, or through social media, than they are to see it in the official county newspaper. All right, let's talk about executive sessions. Again, closed portion of an otherwise open meeting. That means that you cannot have an executive session if you have not already been in an open meeting. You cannot have an executive session outside the context of an open meeting. So you can't, for example, say that, oh, Commissioner so-and-so and I were meeting in an executive session. If you are outside of an open meeting, an executive session cannot exist. So you cannot have an executive session outside an open meeting. That means that you have to have a properly called and noticed meeting with the time, the date, and the place of the meeting. You have to have a majority of the body there. You have to have interactive communication taking place between the body, and they have to be talking about business that may come before the body. You have to have all of the elements of an open meeting before you can go into executive session. So you have to have all of those things. You have to have the notice, you have to have the body there, you have to have interactive communication, and you have to have that communication be about business that can come before the body. Only then can you adjourn into an executive session, into that closed portion of the otherwise open meeting. All right, so what do we need to go into an executive session? Well, we have to have a motion, and that motion has to include three things. It has to include the statutory justification for going into executive session. It has to include the subject of the executive session, and then it has to include when the open meeting will resume following the executive session. The motion has to include those three things. If it does not include those three things, if it does not include any one of those three things, that is a technical violation to not include them. So you need to make sure that when you are making the motion for executive session, you have a statutory justification that allows you to cite to the statute that lets you go into the executive session for that particular topic. You need to have the subject of the executive session outlined in the motion, and then you need to have the time when that meeting, when the open portion of the meeting will resume following the executive session. And we really want to think about clarity when we're talking about that executive session motion. We want to think about making it clear to all of our constituents, to all of the public, what is going on in that executive session. Obviously, there are times where you want to respect the privacy of the individuals that are going to be in the executive session, but you still want to be clear about the subject matter and about the justification of going into executive session. Looks like we have another question. What if the open meeting is closed, but you are in the study session that was advertised? Can you go into an executive session? Well, the open meeting isn't really ever closed. So even if you are in a study session or a work session, that's still part of an open meeting. So it's not really a closed session at that point. People can still be there and observe the work session or whatever that may be. So you can still go into executive session during a work session. Now, obviously, I would not recommend going into executive session during a work session because people may not anticipate that you are going. They may not into executive session. They may not have been following that particular work session because that work session is taking place before or after the actual open meeting with things on the schedule and on the agenda. So I would actually recommend not going into executive sessions during study sessions or work sessions. You want to probably save all of those types of things for the open meeting because again, you want to make sure that not only that you are being transparent, but that the public perceives you as being transparent because they know that you are taking care of that business in executive session or in the light that you are going into executive session only during the open meeting and not during the study session when maybe less people are paying attention. You don't want them to get the impression that you may be trying to hide the ball or anything like that. So I would recommend only going into executive session during the actual meeting portion and not during study sessions and work sessions. Now, again, the subject, the justification, the statutory justification and the subject need to match. So if you say, for example, that you're going into executive session to discuss non-elected personnel, the subject of that executive session discussion needs to match up to that and be about non-elected personnel. That means you cannot go into executive session to discuss the county clerk because the county clerk is elected. You can, however, go into executive session to discuss the staff of the county clerk because they are not elected. Looks like we have another question about municipalities having a budget retreat that isn't open to the public. Is that a violation of KOMA? So if they are having a budget discussion outside of an open meeting, that would probably be problematic in relation to KOMA. It may be that a lot of people don't attend those types of budget retreats and study sessions and things like that. But those do need to be open and available to the public in case somebody does decide to show up. Because again, if you're having a budget discussion, that is obviously business that could come before the body. You need to make sure that the public is able to participate or attend that particular meeting so that they can observe. Because again, you don't have to have things like you don't have to have public comment or those types of things, but you do need to make sure that if they are having discussions about the budget, that the public is able to observe those discussions. Again, diving back into executive sessions, the justification and the subject have to match in order for you to have those discussions. Got a question here. Can you go in and talk about the staff and the issues the staff is having with the elected official? So remember, this is only related to more than one commissioner. This is only related to a majority of the body having those discussions. So at any time, one commissioner can go and talk to any other staff about issues or problems or ask questions. That is always perfectly fine. Commissioners are always able to go and have those discussions. What commissioners have to be wary of is multiple commissioners. So more than a majority of the body going in and having those discussions with staff or other elected officials That is where you get into trouble, is when there are multiple, but any individual commissioner can go to other county staff and ask questions or have discussions outside of an open meeting. Got another question. What if commissioners just request executive session for 15 minutes and then mark on a sheet why? They don't actually state the reason. That would be a technical violation, as I mentioned before. If you don't have all three elements, if you don't have the statutory justification, the subject, and when you are going to resume the open meeting, the open portion of the meeting, if you don't have all three of those things, that is a technical violation. And we have seen several cities and counties get warnings and get additional training required by the Attorney General's office as a result of those types of technical violations. You need to make sure that when you are going into executive session, and I can't stress this enough, when you are going into executive session, you must have all three of those elements. The statutory justification, you have to have a subject, and you have to have when the open meeting will resume. What would be a situation where the staff of an election official is discussed, such as termination of employment? That could definitely be one of those, one of the reasons that you would discuss staff of an elected official. Termination could be other sorts of discipline. You also may have discussions if it's an extended leave. You also have things like that where somebody is taking extended leave or things of that nature, where the county commissioners may need to be informed that, for example, the deputy clerk is going to be out of the office for several weeks or months because of medical issues or something like that. So you want to make sure that you're having that discussion in executive session, because again, there are some privacy concerns related to that, but you want to at least let them know that. Got a question here. Commissioners can only suggest disciplinary action, but can't enforce it. That is correct, that for other elected officials, they have oversight over their departments, but it's still good to make sure that you have that discussion with commissioners, obviously, in that executive session. Got another question. What happens and what is the process to go through if a person realizes there's been a technical violation? If there has been a technical violation, obviously you want to try and correct that in the time. You want to go back and get a corrected motion. You want to acknowledge that there was a mistake on the motion, and get that corrected as quickly as possible after you realize it. If you realize it before you go into executive session, for example, you realize that you did not get the correct motion on the record, go back and make sure you get the correct motion. We want to, again, make sure that we're avoiding the technical violations as much as possible. So getting that information out there and making sure that you correct those things when you do realize that there's been a mistake. That's always important. Got a question. Have you done your due diligence if you provide the facts about executive sessions to commissioners and they don't follow them? Well, certainly violations of the Open Meetings Act do fall personally on individuals. So that is on the commissioners. But as staff, you should be doing all that you can to make sure that this is happening correctly, that they are going into executive session with the correct motions and things like that, because that does need to also be reflected in the minutes that they went into executive session upon enacting the proper motion. What can happen to a municipality that continues to have KOMA violations? At some point, if a municipality or a county or another taxing jurisdiction continues to have problems with KOMA violations, they could face fines. $500 fines is typically you'll get a warning and get some instructions to have training. But if you continue to have violations, you could face fines from the Attorney General's office. Who can staff go to when the elected official is not treating the staff well? That's kind of more of an HR type of issue. That's really not within within Open Meetings Act. I would say you should have a process for complaints within your county, but that's really slightly more off topic for this particular discussion. But you should have a process for any types of complaints for how you would handle that at your county level. Okay, we have another question. The commission goes into executive session to discuss a raise for an individual. They come out of executive session and report no action taken. Later, you find out that individual was given a raise. So if they're going into executive session should be the time where they are getting information on why they should or shouldn't give a raise or take whatever action they're taking. But when they come out of executive session, they still need to, for instance, if they need to approve a contract, or if they need to approve the raise, or if they need to take that type of action, that vote still needs to take place in the open session. So that all of the discussion that was taking place in executive session, they don't have to get into that, but they do need to take that vote in the open session. Let's keep moving here. So executive session, don't go into executive session if there's no statutory justification. And I want to look really quickly at the statutory justifications. You can find all of the statutory justifications in KSA 75-4319B. These are some of the most popular ones. These are not all of them, but these are some of the most popular ones. As you see, I've listed, there are other justifications under the law, but the five that I listed are kind of the most commonly used by counties in particular. And so you probably want to know these and know where they are in the statute, but there are some other justifications that are out there that you can also use, although these five are kind of the most common. Again, executive session is not a place to make decisions. You want to be getting information in executive session so that you can make decisions in the open session. You're not supposed to be voting in executive session. So here's a sample motion, and this is a sample motion that meets most of the criteria, that meets the criteria that you need to have in executive session motion. I do recommend that you also, within your executive session motion, include who will be included, which is the language that's there in red. That way you demonstrate who was in that executive session. So I recommend that you add that into your executive session language. All right, so let's talk about some things that you should be doing in executive session. The first thing, you should have a clean table when you go into executive session, and you should have a clean table when you come out of executive session. And the reason that you should have a clean table when you go in and come out of executive session is because anything that is being referenced during an open meeting can become part of an open record. And so if you are receiving, for example, private financial information, you don't want to leave that private financial information laying out on the table for when you come out of executive session, because if there's any reference to that material during the open meeting, then that is automatically an open record, and obviously you don't want to make those types of things public. Got a question here. Is there a book or manual that you can print off or order? The Attorney General has some materials on their website. We also have some materials on our website that are available. We will be making, we try to make information available on executive session for that. And then we have a question, does the employer-employee negotiations also apply to elected officials? No, you cannot go into executive session to discuss elected officials. You have to do that in an open session. So again, when you go into or come out of executive session, your area should be clean. Oh, and I also see there was a question about property sale. apply the same as property acquisition. Yes, you can have those discussions in executive session, but any vote, any decision needs to be made in the open public session. You should also respect the confidentiality of the discussions of executive session. So you should make sure when you are having those discussions in executive session that you keep those things confidential, that you don't talk about the substance of what you talked about in executive session outside of that. You also should not be talking about different topics in executive session. If you have multiple things that you need to discuss, multiple topics that you need to hit on, you should be making the separate motions within the executive session. You should not be talking about multiple topics in one executive session. You should go into the executive session for 5 minutes and talk about the first topic, come out, adjourn back into executive session to talk about the next topic, and so on until you get through all of the things. You should not be doing anything that is not listed in your executive session motion. And again, you should not be voting within the executive session. That is something that you should never be doing in executive session. All right, I want to get to the best practices so that I can leave you with some good tips before we wrap up our time here as we are getting close to the end. Write out your executive session motions in advance. This helps make sure that you have the statutory justification, that you have the subject and the statutory justification matching, and then you can just fill in the time. Write those things out so that they are ready beforehand, so that you are not stumbling into executive session and potentially making the kinds of mistakes that get you technical violations. It's better to be prepared, and the best way to do that is by writing that motion out in advance. Make sure also that the other nice thing about writing that motion out in advance is that if you write that motion out in advance, you can reflect that motion by just adding that written motion to the minutes. Once you are done and preparing the actual minutes, you have the full motion there to supply to the minutes. For commissioners and for county officials, do not communicate by proxy. So if an elected official, if a county commissioner tells you something, do not pass that along to other county commissioners outside of the open meeting. You can have those discussions in open meeting. You can talk about that during the next meeting. Be mindful of business that may come before the body. And this is something that our commissioners need to always be thinking about. You need to have in your mind that you need to be careful about talking about business that may come before the body outside of your open meeting. If that does come up, you can remind everybody we can take that up at our next meeting and leave off the discussion at that. Make sure that you are not returning from executive session early. If you said 2 o'clock, do not start talking about things at 1:58 because the public will return at 2 o'clock. And if they were waiting for that next piece of discussion, they may be upset that you launched into that prior to them being able to come back. And then if you are extending an executive session, in other words, if you said that you're going to have executive session for 10 minutes and you discover after 9.5 minutes that you're not quite done with that discussion, when you come out of executive session at the 10-minute mark, restate the entire motion so that it's clear that you're going back into executive session on that same topic. Obviously, update the time when you will come back into the open meeting and then adjourn back into executive session after restating that entire motion. Those are the tips that I have for everybody. Are there any other questions that we need to get into before I let everybody go so that you can grab some lunch?
Hey, Jay, there is one new question there if you didn't see it from Christy.
Oh, I think I touched on the employee negotiation for elected officials.
Okay.
If I didn't, again, you cannot have discussions about elected officials within executive session. That does not fall under the statutory justification, you have to have those discussions in open session. Are there any other questions? If not, thank you to everybody for joining us this morning. And I look forward for those of you that are going to join us here in about an hour for KORA. Look forward to talking to a lot of you then. So enjoy your lunch, and we will see some of you here in about an hour.